before we hit the Hungarian Grand Prix, a couple bits of news that I want to get into. The first being that FIA is allegedly set to approve 2 new F1 teams on the grid, Andretti being one of those teams. Laurence, do we think that this report is legit that's coming out over the last 24 hours?
Yeah, it probably is. It's a good story. Michael Schmidt is the journalist behind it. He's been in F1 for ever, it seems, but he works auto, motor and sport and has got this story. And it is in line with what we expected. We knew that the FIA was looking at new teams coming in, basically evaluating whether they're in a position to come into the sport from a sporting perspective, from a financial perspective, lots of different checks going on in the background. And we also know that really we're going to find out towards the end of July which teams have made the cut. There was speculation that no teams would get in. There was speculation that maybe one team was getting, but this looks like it's 2. And the likely 2 candidates are Andretti, who have teamed up with Cadillac. And we know a lot about that entry because they've been very vocal about the fact they want to come into Formula One. And the other one is High Tech GP, which announced, I think it was just a few weeks ago now, their plans. Of course, their plans had already been submitted to the FIA. So 2 teams that are very keen to come in. Now, if they get to this stage, that's one thing, being approved by the FIA. But then Formula One also has to approve them, really, because in order for them to exist in the F1 ecosystem, they need to be signed up to what we call the Concord Agreement, which is really just a fancy way of saying the agreement that keeps the teams, the FIA and the F1 together. And probably one of the biggest factors in that is who gets money. And if these new teams are not signed up to a Concord Agreement, they can't really compete in F1 because they won't be receiving any prize money. So that's the next step that has to happen. F1 has to agree as well. And while the FIA throughout this whole process, especially the FIA president, Mohammed Ben Sulayem, has been very keen on the idea of new teams joining the grid, F1 has been a little bit more kind of skeptical about the value they can bring. And a lot of that, I think, has been reflected in what the existing teams have said. They don't actually get a say on who comes in, but they're very wary about protecting their position in the sport. So yeah, it's going to be a fascinating few weeks. And all of this really could as well, if F1 does decide to take a different approach to allowing these new teams in, it could feed this already existing tension that we have between the FIA, which looks after the sporting side, basically the policeman of the sport, and F1, which looks after the money and the commercial side.
When was the last time, Nate, that we had more than 10 teams on the grid?
Great question. Last time we had, I just had this in front of me. Was it 2014, 2015? I think that's the last time.
I think end of 2014 was when we lost Caterham. We had Manor though still going.
And then Haas came in, didn't they?
Yeah, so there was a stage.
Yeah, so we're looking at 2010, 2012 when there was a lot of teams on the grid, a lot more teams on the grid. But unfortunately, those teams all had kind of the newer teams that would join tended to have a history of just kind of dropping off the grid, financial difficulties, etc. And Haas is the newest team to have joined Formula One. And they've kind of bucked that trend because obviously they're still going strong. And I think it's interesting actually to kind of look back at those days of when teams dropped off, because a team like Haas, I know that Formula One teams don't necessarily have a say, but I don't think Formula One's going to push ahead with 2 of these new teams if any of the teams are existing teams aren't too happy with it. If you're a team like Haas or you're one of the smaller teams, you're looking at it right now and you're saying, we made our investment in Formula One at a much, I suppose, less popular time for the sport. Things weren't what they are right now. Kind of rode that wave, probably lost money, gained money, but there's probably a lot of risk there. And I think that there is a feeling among those teams that are currently on the grid that it's like, well, why should we give up these, this slice of the pie, as it were, to teams coming in? We've been there since teams were dropping off years ago. We had to battle through that, and now the sport looks great. All these new teams want to join, so really fascinating dynamic in play. But yeah, it's been a while, so long that I couldn't even tell you the date straight off the top of my head, even though I knew you were going to ask me. It just completely dropped out of my head. So apologies, Katie, and to our listeners for that terrible answer.
No, I think it's
better. I'll do better. I'll do better with the next one.
You have Bucharest on your mind. That's why.
I still do. Yeah, I was still thinking maybe I should have just gone for the holiday. Yeah. Maybe I should at this rate. Maybe this is a sign that I should revive that old booking.
Yeah, I think, though, it's an interesting distinction, though, because FIA proves it's not a guarantee that this is actually going to happen because the F1 piece comes into play. The teams don't have a legitimate vote to say yes or no, correct? But I have to imagine that team principals certain members of power will be in Stefano Domenicali's ear one way or the other of if they approve of this or want this, or if they absolutely dislike this premise. So why? Because I think the general consensus, Laurence, is that F1 teams don't like the idea of adding more teams at this point. Why is that? Why is that kind of the general consensus and stance at this point?
It's really protecting the investment. So if you are one of 10 bits of a pie, then that's going to be a certain size. If you're one of 11 or one of 12, then obviously that size gets smaller. Now, this has been thought about, and currently there's an anti-dilution fee of 200 million, which a new team would have to pay, and it would get split among the existing teams. And there's all sorts of math you can run on that and whether that would be beneficial or not. But the teams that exist at the moment have decided, considering the value that have been put against some of the teams recently, you can think of Alpine and the new investors there, putting that team at over $900 million, that perhaps that $200 million isn't high enough. Now, there are lots of conflicting views on that and which way they should go. But that's ultimately it, is that the teams that already exist in F1 want to protect the income they have from F1, and they don't particularly want to share it with anyone else. And they say, well, if we are going to share it, whoever is coming in needs to increase the size of the pie. You need to increase it so that each of those slices is just bigger by the amount that F1 can draw in totally. So it's a really tough value game to weigh up. I think ultimately the teams are all acting in self-interest, and that's probably not surprising. But as you correctly said, they don't really have a say other than influence. They have been quite vocal in the press. The one team that has been less so is probably Alpine, but that's because they're likely to have an engine deal. Perhaps even they could explore the idea of chassis deals and probably gearbox as well, with new teams coming in because they don't have any engine customers at the moment. So there's a few different views floating around the paddock, but from most of the teams, the general consensus seems to be, let's protect what we've got. James Vowles, who is the Williams team's principal, talked about it in Silverstone. I thought it was quite interesting that he said, there's still a lot of F1 teams, even with the budget cap, that are still operating at a loss. And so, until we can get to a position where all the teams are making a lot of profit, really we should be questioning whether there is enough, interest in F1 as well, and long term, because it shouldn't just be a short term decision based on the popularity of the sport right now. It should be based on a long term strategy for F1. So all of these factors have to be considered, and that's ultimately what will give us an answer. But if it is true that the FIA has approved it, that that is a big step, because it suggests that at least two of these proposed new teams, and there was only enough space for two, but at least two of them have everything in place according to the FIA, which regulates the sport, to run a certainly competent Formula One team. And I think there is a fear as well that if those checks hadn't been in place and they hadn't been done thoroughly, you might end up with teams coming unprepared to the grid and running around at the back and ultimately running out of money. So the good news is that from the FIA's perspective, at least, if this story is correct, then there are two teams that have the potential to come onto the grid and compete, which is pretty cool.
First off, I love the pie analogy. It reminded me of the viral video. Do you remember the English woman whose boyfriend is filming her and asks, could you eat 8 pieces of pizza or 10 pieces of pizza? And she's like, oh, I could eat 8 pieces of pizza, but I couldn't do 10. And he's like, but it's the same size, and he's trying to explain basic math to her. It's one of my favorite English videos of all time. So thank you for explaining basic math to us. Nate, for you, would you like to see more teams on the grid? When you referenced a time ago that it was clearly unsuccessful and teams seem to be dropping like flies if they couldn't financially handle it.
Yeah, I mean, if it works, I think that's the key thing. I think if anytime there's new teams, it means if this, let's say these 2 new teams do join the grid, that's 4 new drivers. It's 4 spots where we get to see, younger drivers coming in, you maybe see more movement in a driver market. The whole ecosystem of the sport becomes healthier. But I think that's the big kind of red flag in the whole thing, is that it has to be safe, because the worst thing you could have is a new team coming in and then just dropping off, as Laurence mentioned. It's going to be interesting as well. I think that on 2 reasons, either team. Andretti, I don't think Michael Andretti really endeared himself to the F1 teams earlier this year. If you remember, he called them greedy earlier in January, I think it was, when Ben Sulayem was really pushing the Andretti Cadillac entry, which is really, it's not really the thing you should do to a group of people that have all that influence behind the scenes. High Tech's also interesting. So that's the team that used to be very closely run by Dmitry Mazepin, who's Nikita Mazepin's dad. He's actually given up the ownership, or at least publicly, of that team, but it's still believed to have a lot of say from him. And I think F1 are very, very cautious about the links to Russia at this point. So that's going to be interesting on that side to see if that kind of gets through that process. And that might, I mean, it may be used as just an excuse to kind of to knock them back as well. But I think if Lawrence is absolutely right, you know, if the FIA has done their due diligence here and these two teams have business models that work long term, then I think it'd be great for F1 to do this. And you know, we're always gutted when, you know, people, you know, I know Daniel Ricciardo's come back now, but when he dropped off the grid, if there'd been more options for him, you know, maybe he wouldn't have been in that situation in the first place. You know, a guy like De Vries, maybe, you know, he'd have somewhere else to go. I don't know. It just makes everything a lot more fun. So, yeah, I'd be all for it, but I think I'm skeptical because it doesn't know, from what I've heard from the F1 side, none of the bids have really come in and really been like, this is the one. There's always been something behind the scenes there. But again, as Lawrence mentioned a few times, there's self-interest always at play. So you just never know. You've always got to take it with a bit of a pinch of salt when F1 teams are telling you these new teams don't look great. You've got to be like, well, yeah, of course you're going to say that. So yeah, you know, good luck to them. And I hope either way, it's going to be a great story, because I think that the key is that if it doesn't go the way the FAA wants it, it's just another wedge in that relationship with F1 that we've seen growing and growing and growing for a while.
Thanks so much for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content and live streaming, subscribe to ESPN Plus.